His foreign assignment is his third reporting job at the Times, since he joined the paper in 1997 as a metropolitan reporter in New York and moved to the national desk in 1999 as bureau chief in Houston. He covered presidential politics, the collapse of Enron, the death penalty, water policy, and even a town where the mayor is a beer-drinking goat. All of these which I think qualified him to be a Beijing bureau reporter. In the months after the September 11th terror attacks, he wrote many investigative pieces about the hijackers. Before joining the Times, Jim worked as a national desk reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution from 1990 to 1997. Based in Atlanta, Birmingham, and New Orleans, he covered stories in the Deep South as well as regional and national politics. As I'm sure everyone knows, Jim Yardley was awarded the 2006 Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting. In 2007, a three-part article that he did, Crisis on the Yellow River, published in the Asia edition of the International Herald Tribune, won the Society of Publishers in Asia Award for explanatory reporting. Please join me in welcoming Jim Yardley.
Thank you very much. Find somewhere to put this down. I'm really happy to be here. I would be dishonest if I said I was overwhelmingly happy standing before you speaking. I'm much more comfortable taking notes on other people speaking than doing it myself. But I did have a little training a few days ago. I stood before my daughter's third grade class, and they barraged me with questions about energy and the environment. So I feel toughened and battle hardened. So I'm gonna go forward. When Tom asked me to speak, he basically asked me to talk about a couple of things. And after listening to so many experts here and who have such expertise, which I do not have, it made sense that he just wanted me to talk about what it means to be a journalist in China, a foreign journalist, and covering the environment and doing that. So I'd like to offer a few thoughts about that. And I'd also just want to say how useful this has been for me. I have been sitting in the back waiting to speak, and then someone says something illuminating. I take my computer out, I pound out some notes, and then I put it down and I do it over and over again. So this has been hugely helpful as a journalist. I've at least got 4 or 5 story ideas, so that means it's time well served. I arrived in Beijing, as Tom said, actually on August 12th, 2003. And I very vividly remember that morning. My family, at the time I had 2 children, I now have 3, and we were packed into a hotel room on the east side of Beijing. And a nice hotel room, but a hotel room nonetheless. And we were all crazy with jet lag, and so we woke up well before daybreak and stood, and the sun slowly, gradually rose, and it was this sort of boiling orange ball. And it was rising over the tops of the embassy district, and I looked out and I was sort of bleary-eyed, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was rising through. There was this sort of dark, gauzy something, and I'd never really experienced a Beijing sunrise before. And I actually took my camera and shot a picture of it, thinking that this was a great historic moment, that I was seeing the most polluted sunrise in known history. And now that I've lived in Beijing for 4.5 years, I've actually experienced days, as has my good friend Ma Jun, days that rate 500 out of 500 on the government's pollution standard. And I pull that picture out and I look at it and I sort of say, could be worse, not so bad. And that sort of reassessment, I think, is typical and a little bit frightening, because those of us living in Beijing, we certainly understand it's a polluted city, but it does become easier to forget that living in that sort of pollution is not typical. I mentioned Ma Jun again. Yesterday we saw each other for the first time and we're like giddy kids because we were walking around breathing, and it was so nice here. And I felt as if I was a drug addict and I wanted to keep this high. So you were very lucky, and I hope that one day China will be like this as well, because it certainly deserves to be. As a foreign journalist, China is incredible. It is exhilarating. It is monumentally frustrating. It is wonderful, exasperating. It is, the whole mix. And the contradictions of the place are endless. People are constantly giving me advice on what my priorities should be and what I should do as a reporter in China. And two pieces of advice have stood out to me. Not that I necessarily agree with them or totally disagree with them, but I think they're worth repeating. The first is that the longer you stay in China, the less certain you'll actually be about what you think you know. And the second is no matter what you write on whatever subject, you're going to be right and you're going to be wrong. And that's not quite all the news that's fit to print, but it is certainly a good reason to stay humble. And I do think as a foreign journalist, that is important to always be open-minded and how we assess China, because it's such a monumentally complicated place. In the United States, Tom mentioned I covered Texas prior to coming to China. I imagine some people in this room would consider Texas a foreign assignment, but I did a little bit of environmental coverage there, and but it was not a specialty of mine. And when I first got here, we had, I think we have 5 or 6 reporters throughout China, if you count Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. And we had some veteran folks, and so I sort of was rooting around for what I could pay attention to, and I thought the environment would be a good subject. And so I started writing about it pretty quickly, and I traveled extensively. As a matter of fact, I have 1 more year to go in China, and I need to go to Xinjiang and Hainan Island, and I will have been to every province in the country. So, and in doing that, I just began to see that I just began to see the obvious, that just about every major city was incredibly polluted in the air, and that the streams and the rivers were often in just terrible shape. I mean, in the Huai River Basin, which is sort of the poster region of the inability of China to clean up a river basin, you can literally go to streams that are black, and I've seen they're curdling with yellow foam. And those are the worst case scenarios, but they're nonetheless true. And in the north, where I live, the rivers truly are dead. You drive through the North China Plain and you see river beds that are sort of like abandoned highways, and they cut across the ground, and it's quite a sight, and it's just a reminder of the enormous strain that the population of China has on what is not nearly enough good arable land, and also of decisions that have been made in the past that probably weren't the best. But the broad and immediate explanation for the problems that you see in pollution is that is sort of the price of progress, or of unchecked progress. And so as I traveled around and I've seen pollution at a sort of stunning scale, equally stunning and sort of impressive and amazing is the scale of development and the energy and the drive that the people have for that. You can go, I think Mark Levine yesterday cited some pretty amazing statistics about cement, and that China uses roughly half the world's cement. And I certainly believe that. It's slowed down a little bit now because the Olympics are getting close, but in Beijing, certainly last year, I think on any given week, you would look and see 1,000 construction cranes in the city, maybe twice that. It's just impossible to know, but it's this gargantuan amount. I was interested to hear about the development possibilities in Qingdao, because I was in Qingdao once doing a story, and I got in a car and I drove out one of the highways just heading west, and I'd say for 10, 20, 30 miles, tens of thousands of concrete apartments all going up at exactly the same time. And it was just, to an American, I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, when they put the one single big building in town, it was just press coverage for weeks. So, the contrast is quite dramatic. The Times Foreign Report, if you read it on Saturday, has something called the Saturday Profile. And what we try to do is we try to find someone who's interesting and an international, this is in the foreign section, and I'd gotten there for a while, and like everybody in this room, began to pay attention to this incredibly loudmouth, outspoken vice minister at the State Environmental Protection Administration, and Pan Yue. And Mr. Pan is quite an interesting guy. He is he was very outspoken at a time when being a sort of Chinese senior official is much more politic to stick with a herd, at least publicly. And he was talking a great deal about China's environmental problems. So I sought an interview, and I shockingly got it. And I went and we talked, and he warned that China was really creating some problems of monumental scale it had to address immediately. These problems were not all of China's doing. He made a careful point of talking about some of the trends in globalization that we've been talking about, but nonetheless, he spoke very candidly about it, which with me was great. In other interviews, he's been even more candid, talking about that China really faces health and catastrophe problems if it doesn't deal with this. So it was interesting because it was China criticizing China, official China criticizing China, and that was unique. And so I wrote a piece about him. Now, Pan likes being a provocateur. He likes attention, so that is fun. But it was also clear, and this was sort of interesting at the time when I was just learning about the environment, that he had political cover, that he's not stupid, and that he would speak because somewhere he figured out he could. Of course, I'm sure every week he figures out how much he can say, but but he nonetheless could. And I mentioned him, Pan, because really, as far as official China, he more than anyone has sort of taken environmentalism into the public domain. He's made a big effort on universities and start clubs. And his agency, SIPA, is certainly gaining influence, but it's important to remember it's definitely a very junior partner within the Chinese bureaucracy, the ministerial bureaucracy in Beijing. The bureaucracy is still driven by the ministries that drive GDP. That is the overwhelming remaining ideology of the party. And it is interesting, and I agree with the speakers who say they're shifting now, but in shifting a giant, massive ship is a long, difficult process. I think it's interesting to point out with SIPA that there are lots of regulations, but it's also true that they have very few people. It's a very difficult task they face, and so just adding that sort of capacity is going to be a major challenge for them. I bring him up because Mr. Pan is very good at using the media, and I think yesterday it was Wang Lili who spoke about the role of the Chinese media, and she made the point that they're doing a great job in spreading awareness and also sort of drawing attention to pollution incidents. And I thought that was, she basically cast them as advocates within a system. And I'm an American journalist, and so I sort of aspire. I'm sure some people would say that journalists fail at this, but I aspire for a certain degree of detachment. And when I hear that I'm sort of part of a process, I sort of get nervous. But I think that in China's context, Ms. Wang is quite right, and that Chinese journalists have played a vital role and will continue to play a vital role in expanding Chinese awareness of the environmental problems, but also in continuing to report on pollution incidents, on things happening around the country. It's I mean, anyone here knows that Chinese propaganda officials keep very tight control over a lot of issues. I always find it fascinating that I think other than the day that Hu Jintao was named president and party chief, when there was a short biography of him in People's Daily, I don't think there has ever been a feature story about him and his personal life ever in Chinese mainstream or state media, even the kind that George Bush would kill for. Like Hu Jintao, he's a great guy. So it gives you a sense that certain things are completely off topic. The environment is different. The government has chosen to put it as something that the Chinese media can write about, and certainly within limits, and they do. And they should be credited with that. And I think that some of the things that Ma Jun is doing, the Chinese media also play a really important role. They were Chinese journalists. We spoke earlier, I think, about the Songhuajiang, which was the big benzene spill at the end of 2005, which I think Newsweek or somebody referred to as China's Katrina. That may or may not be right, but it was certainly a gigantic event, and ultimately the Chinese press, after some restriction, got it out and then expanded upon it and then ran with it for a while. Of course, they ran with it until they were told not to run with it, and then the running stopped immediately. But it was interesting, the role that they play. I think it's we should, I'm a foreign journalist, and in the back of I go and do a lot of things that I are risky, I guess. But in the back of my mind, I have an American passport, and I always know that if I'm doing something or going somewhere I shouldn't be, it's not going to be, I'm ultimately going to be okay. Chinese journalists are doing many of them, not all of them, but some of them, are doing a really fine job of trying to bring environmental problems to the awareness, not just of the people, but to the officials who are sympathetic. I think that's important to note. I personally think Beijing wants them doing this to some degree. But yeah, again, I wanted to add one more thing to that, which was that there is a limit. I was very struck. I don't know if any of you paid attention to the Three Gorges situation this year, but there's been a sort of drip of coverage in the state media about various problems that have arisen. You can see little things coming out of different studies that show problems. And then suddenly in September, Xinhua, the state news agency, ran a story that came out, and it was sort of encapsulated a meeting of officials and experts in Wuhan. And the headline was something along the lines of Three Gorges faces potential catastrophe if environmental situation isn't amended. As a foreign reporter, if I see Xinhua warning of catastrophe, I like get in my car and start driving to the Three Gorges because it's just obvious that something is going on. And there was coverage, and it was interesting, and it got everybody stirred up and interested in the Three Gorges. And then what's quite interesting in the last couple of weeks is it all went away. And we've now had press conferences basically saying that everything is okay, and that the media has exaggerated things. And so it's interesting to see the range of what you can and can't do. So again, Chinese journalists, I think for the most part, I really applaud them. It takes a lot of guts to know how far to push the system and when not to, and whatever. They're performing a good public service. As a foreign journalist, I have a very different setup. I believe I'm basically a guest of the foreign ministry. I have a special visa that is a J visa, and it took about 5 or 6 months of paperwork to get it. And then everywhere and so on my visa, and my family, my 3-year-old boy who speaks better Chinese than English has a J visa. So so what that means for him if he decides to drive off to a hotel and check in without me is that in theory, the hotel clerk would notify the local public security that a J visa is in town. In practice, that is inconsistent in how it's applied. And more recently, the government, in the spirit of the Olympics, has deliberately loosened reporting rules, which I can tell you about. But I still think that, I was told by Orville, actually, I don't know if he's here, but I was told by Orville that they have instituted a national computer network that when J visas show up at a hotel, the hotel taps, I assume it's only a certain caliber of hotel, the hotel can tap into a database and place you on the grid, which seems almost too sophisticated for any country, but anyway, whatever, maybe they can do it. People often ask me, am I censored in what I write? And the answer is no. I write, when I write a story, I don't have to go and show it to anybody other than my editors, and they're occasionally not the greatest, but I send it off. Where issues arise, obviously, is in access to information, access to officials. I actually think to some degree they're getting better, but I do think that it's a tough. Sometimes it's very difficult to get information. I actually think the system damages China in ways that the Communist Party doesn't realize, because I think they're sort of intuitively and instinctively accustomed to safeguarding information even when they don't need to, and in fact, the keeping it private makes them seem more suspicious than they really are. But I think that culturally, this just takes a while to get there. The Olympics has been interesting because in the past, every time I left Beijing without permission, I was breaking the law. And I left Beijing a lot. And so what that generally meant was that if you go somewhere, you could be if the officialdom noticed you, or if you're the only non-Chinese guy in the town, or somebody became suspicious when you asked questions, they could come to you and ask you what you're doing. And most of the time it would be very polite, but they would sort of shoo you on your way back to Beijing. And it's many times it's been less than polite, but it's nonetheless, you know, it's not Iraq. You know, it's there's sort of I mean, there are definitely, you know, rules, and most even it's okay. What the Olympics has changed is they've essentially given us a theoretical license to travel. And so in the past, so all I need is the permission. If I'm going to go to Qingdao and interview Tom, Tom just has to give me permission to come interview him. What the state security does doesn't matter. So I've actually been skating pretty nicely for over a year or so. So I don't know if I've just gotten better at it or if it really has gotten easier. But other journalists have had the opposite, though. Even with the new rules, there have been, there was I don't remember if it was Reuters or somebody was beaten outside Beijing recently when they attempted to go to illegal prison. They're illegal holding facilities outside Beijing where some people are put because they come to complain. Anyway, so my guess is that it's still, despite the new rules, if you go to the wrong place, you're going to get shooed away. So that's sort of the practical conditions of my job. It is, but it should be also said that China is a wonderfully disorganized place, and that disorganization and scale, and people are wonderfully. Ordinary people are tremendously inviting and interested in someone who's interested in them. So more often than not, when you go somewhere, you can just sort of seep around and people are dying to talk to you, ordinary people. So it's really quite nice and fun. And they're always just wondering who this, you know, unidentified flying object is who comes into the village. But anyway, but in addition to how we do our job, well, there are also sort of questions about how we choose what we write about. And this obviously, given, you know, this is an interesting subject for people who are interested in China because there are camps of people, and I'll get emails from people who say I'm too hard, and I'll get emails from people who say I'm too soft. And, but even beyond that debate is sort of how you approach reporting about China. I work in a two-person bureau. My colleague Joe Kahn, who has actually been a China hand, as they call it, for 20 years. He knows quite a bit. So he and I have been fortunate that we have a good working relationship, so we've worked together, but we've sort of faced this interesting predicament. And that is that foreign news, as the American media usually defines it, is sort of driven by two factors. One is politics, and one is conflict. And so if you notice, if you read foreign news, there's quite a lot of stuff about various elections or various things in Venezuela right now. Or there's quite a lot of sad news, unfortunately, about conflict, whether it's American conflict such as what's happening in Iraq, or whether what's going on in Africa, which we are, you know, less directly involved in. But so China falls into a different mix. We don't really have any real elections, and we don't have, thankfully, any wars. And yet China is, without question, after terrorism in Iraq, the single most important story for America. So it creates questions of, well, how exactly do we write about it? And so what we've tried to do is pick big thematic approaches. We've tried, and it's a little risky because if you're wrong, you really look stupid. But we've tried to sort of look at it in broad brush ways and figure out what themes are central to the development, social, economic, and political development of the country. I don't do much diplomatic coverage, so I don't write too much about how China and the United States are getting along. I tend to focus more about the relationship between China and its own people and how China's development and growth impact itself and the rest of the world. And the reason that's the way to cover it, in my opinion, is it's just so big. You know, the whole how does the world handle China and India is going to be the story of the next century. So in keeping with that thematic approach, basically in 2004, Joe and I each sort of had done a little running around and came to the conclusion that the first way into looking at the sort of social conditions of the country was to write about inequality, rural and urban inequality. And a lot of our speakers have sort of touched on that. And it's a major issue, and it's now become a top priority of the Hu Jintao Wenjiabao government, which is to deal with that and how to reconcile that. And in dealing with inequality, though, what interested me, and in dealing with all these themes, what interested me was that the environment is a factor in everything. It is not off to the side as a disconnected issue as the sort of mainstream concerns of China plunge forward. So even back in 2004, when we were really, the sort of focus on the environment was less grand, it was obviously part of these larger social trends. And actually one of the stories that I did back then was to go to the Huai River Basin and to write about the cancer villages that have been emerging along the river systems there. And, you know, it was, and part of the argument of the story was, as China urbanizes and in urban areas grow wealthier than poor areas, middle-class people don't like to live in dirty places, so we're beginning to see Chinese cities trying to offload factories, certainly Beijing and Shanghai, to move them out of the cities. And you have poorer rural areas that are often happy to take them, or often have their own enterprises that are sort of directly or indirectly controlled by local officials, and they are very, you know, reluctant to close those down, no matter the pollution. So in the Huai River, I went to a village and I walked around with the village head, which really spoke to his desperation that he was willing to sort of guide me around, because usually that wouldn't be the case. And we walked through the village and he just started pointing at houses and he would say, that person died of cancer, that person died of cancer, and that person's sick. And it was terrible. It was just jarring for me. And then he took me to the local stream, and it was somewhere between dark green and black. And then someone else guided me to some of the local factories, and where we could find the sort of hidden waste pipes. And you literally could, the smell was so horrific that you'd have to step away. I mean, it was just terrible. And so I had this enormous sympathy for these farmers who really, you know, they were in this terrible position of they could do little about it. And just because this enterprise was so important. In fact, the provincial government later gave it a big infusion of money because it needed to stay alive, because it had 14,000 jobs. What was interesting was eventually the village did get a little help. CCTV also came in and did a story, which is a good example of the Chinese press. And they instantly, CCTV is half journalism, half like official Beijing arrives. And so once CCTV got involved, they began to talk about building wells, and they built some deep water wells for them. But as anyone knows, with the groundwater situation, that's sort of a short-term solution. But nonetheless, that was an action they took. I thought it was also interesting that the village head, who was helpful to me and then later to other journalists, was later fired. So it's a reminder that, and that was obviously never ordered by Beijing. It was just, I'm sure whoever the level of bureaucracy above him was embarrassed. And so that often is the way it works. So you can understand why certain people, even if they're sympathetic, you know, you don't want to take too many risks. Let me see. So, oh, and one more thing on this. I did notice a week or two ago, and Majun maybe knows more than I do, that the state health ministry, I think, announced plans to begin some pretty intensive epidemiological studies. I could be wrong, but I think that would be one of the most valuable things that the government could do. Very difficult, but it would be enormously valuable, because I do think there are dramatic health concerns, and we can sort of, there's a lot of information about the impact of air pollution, but less so about water pollution, and I think that would be very useful. A couple more. After we focused on inequality, the next logical step was to look at the law. The law is an interesting thing in China. People are increasingly have this sense that the law imbues them with legal rights, that they have rights. And we take that for granted here. You know, we expect that we can sue you and do whatever we want, and we have rights as citizens. But in China, this is an interesting evolutionary concept, the notion of how the law regards the individual. And And the Communist Party has very much embraced the law as well, because they see a giant chaotic society and they see disputes. And how do we settle disputes? We need to have some sort of respected process to handle disputes. And so they embrace the law. I think it's also true that they want the legal system to maintain them in power. I think there are certainly people within the party who want much more openness and transparency, but I think there's a debate about that within in the party. And for now, the legal system remains under the purview of the party. The court system actually is controlled by the party Congress system, which is controlled by the party itself. So it's an interesting thing where they're trying to set up a more not independent, but a court system that's trusted, and yet at the same time they want to sort of maintain ultimate control. There are quite a few. The environment and the law has become a big field, and anyone here probably knows Wang Sanfa or Zhang Jingjing, and they've done really good work, and so have a lot of other lawyers. I was late on the plane, so I didn't hear what Barbara said about class action lawsuits, but I gather that is still fairly difficult to pull off. But in addition to the role of the individual the law has done, what's been very interesting are the ways it's treated NGOs. The law basically, or the statutes changes in the law, created space in society for NGOs to exist. And NGOs play an enormously important role in China, even though they're often incredibly outnumbered and small. And you have different sorts of NGOs. Of course, you have foreign NGOs that have a presence in China, and you have homegrown NGOs that are Chinese. And there's the amount of information that's being dug up and put into the public domain by these groups is really quite remarkable and enormously helpful to me, selfishly, because it gives me access to information. I think the government has had a uncertain way they deal with NGOs. They're kind of up, hot and cold depending on the mood, and they are at certain times they're eager to they've tightened control, and other times they've allowed more space. And space, I think, is the key word. Creating public space for groups is a very delicate process, and where and if you're one of the groups trying to create space in society for what you can do, you have to learn where the line is. Someone earlier today mentioned Wu Lihong, who is an individual near Lake Tai, who sort of became a one-man band, raising attention to the problems there for some time and predicting there was going to be a catastrophe. And he, for a while, was embraced and was celebrated, I think, as a sort of environmentalist of the year by SEPA or something like that. And then eventually got sort of, I don't know, ensnared. It was very complicated, but he was arrested. And then as he was sitting in jail, all the problems he predicted came true. And even after all of that, he was convicted, and it was seen as he was not allowed to. My understanding was he couldn't bring any witnesses or anything like that. I'm not 100% certain, but it's a reminder that the line of space created by the law for environmental activism is ever changing, often depends on where you are, and often depends on what you do. If you're a local activist directly going after local manufacturers and local officials, it's tricky. And that's another reason that these guys often really use the media to draw attention, because there are sympathetic ears in other levels of government that might take interest in the case. So you can't applaud enough what all these different groups are doing. It's really quite remarkable. I'll go down to where I am next. But one last thought on the law. It's also true that the law, and this is something when we were talking, a lot of people have talked about capacity, and they have talked about, let me see if I can make this any higher, that there are lots of laws out there. Enforcement, implementation is the challenge. I think we mentioned earlier, Ma Jun said, I didn't know it. Actually, I was pretty surprised. There are 3 people who overviewed dam review. That's stunning. That is stunning. And there's always cases where a law, the consistency of application is what's drawn into question. I did a story a couple years ago where there had been a big legal victory, and there had been a factory, 2 factories in Inner Mongolia that had been dumping, or somehow there was dumped into the Yellow River, and the water went downstream to the city of Balto and contaminated the drinking water. So this is a city of, I think, 2 million people, and they had to shut the water down. Well, Balto was not very happy about this, so they sued the upstream factories and city and won. And the factories were told to put the pollution equipment on and to improve their operations. And it was, the Chinese press covered this, and it was seen as a great victory of being able to apply the law. And then, of course, I mean, what happened was, well, the pollution equipment was pretty darn expensive. So what they did instead was they built 2 enormous pits beside the Yellow River and began sort of filling the pits up with the sewage. And over time, the sewage sort of rose up, and a giant storm came along, and they began to see the swells of the sewage, and they were worried it was going to go into the Yellow River. So they broke the levee between the pits and a farming village, and they flooded a farming village with waist-high industrial sewage. And so I actually went, and it was sort of a tricky thing, but and saw it, and it's I mean, the cliche, it's a war zone. It was terrible. So I don't mention that to sort of suggest that that's commonplace in China, because I actually don't think that it is. But it is a reminder that application of law, space for activism varies where you are. This is true in religion, it's true in the environment, it's true in a lot of things. And you know, there are a couple of scholars who talk about warlordism as sort of not being exactly gone in China, that, you know, regional guys have a lot of power and can sort of ignore Beijing. I think Beijing is trying very hard to deal with this, but it was very true there. So, and after dealing with the law, this year we're sort of decided just to go full bore and write about the environment. And so we're writing a series called Choking on Growth, which was a title that an editor came up with. And I haven't yet gotten an email, thank God, from a reader saying I'm choking on growth, but I expect one any day. But what we're trying to do in that series is look at China, and a lot of the speakers have touched on this, and it's been really interesting to me, is that China is in an epic period right now. It is, since 2000, it was already in a sort of 20-year economic miracle, and in 2000, it just went crazy. It absolutely, its use of energy is exponentially blown up. Its level of pollution and development has gone through the roof. And we try to examine that, because now suddenly that's happening at a very inconvenient time. And not just for China and for the people most directly impacted, and those are the Chinese people, but for the rest of the world, because we're all waking up and realizing this global warming thing's kind of not working out. And China and India want to take their rightful place as modern world powers with another 2.5 billion people. I'm not sure the total figure. So what we've tried to do is examine this question, and we've gone through, I've written stories about water scarcity, which has been discussed up in the North China Plain, because China is essentially at this point, and it's trying to move off this course where it's essentially like a juggler, and it's trying to do everything at once. It's trying to industrialize, urbanize, and maintain a farming policy that can sustain 1.3 billion all at the same time, even as it also, on a land supply that is very, not nearly enough, a water supply that is well below world figures. So it's an incredible challenge, and they're doing it in places like the North China Plain, which I think is 200 million people, includes Beijing and Tianjin, and produces half the country's wheat and grain. And it is, its groundwater, I think, has been sucked. In certain cities, it'll be gone in 30 years if there's no change. They're very aware of this. They're trying everything, but ultimately down the road, these guys who talk about sustainability, the reason it's going to be such a problem is how can you do it all? How and where are solutions found? I'm inherently about writing about the problems, but all you guys get to fix it. So I wish you very much the best. It's a I don't even mean that in a facetious way, I really do. But we've, another thing that struck me from listening to everyone here is that we have all of these wonderful proposals. I was particularly struck by your proposal in Qingdao, which because I think I said I went to Qingdao and I saw just zillions and zillions of apartments going up. And so there are all these efforts to put best practices in to make China a model and experimentation zone for more environmentally friendly things. And China actually is ahead of the curve on renewable energy. I did a story, I tried to take a slightly counterintuitive, partly counterintuitive approach to Three Gorges Dam, which was to point out that it's caused huge problems, and dam building is a giant social and environmental problem here. And yet China considers it renewable energy. A lot of other people do. That's a very debatable point, I know, but it's still interesting that the complicated choices that they face. And what's interesting is they're just adding so much capacity of energy, of coal-fired power plants, of urbanization, that even if all these best practices are put in place today, it's stunning the scale of, I mean, just trying to keep up with growth so at a modest level, so in terms of pollution and emissions and energy use, is a tremendous challenge. And so when Hu Jintao talks about sustainable development, I confess it took me a while as a reporter to take like sustainable development and harmonious society as more than catchphrases, and maybe I was more ingrained by American politics when I covered George Bush. And I'll never forget in 2000 when George Bush went to New Hampshire and got his clock cleaned by John McCain, who is talking about his reform credentials. And the next day in Delaware, George Bush arrived a little shaken and gave a press conference, and they rolled out a new banner behind him that says, George Bush, a reformer with results. So he had become a reformer in one day because he needed to politically. So slogans I was suspicious of, but I think in the Chinese context, it's interesting that Hu Jintao, sustainable development definitely means something. And it is something the government aspires to at the highest level. However, having said that, they also have a very difficult problem in that they need and want to maintain high levels of economic growth, and it hasn't been particularly efficient up until now. And I think the other thing that brings to mind is of the environmental and energy changes is, given the way the economy has changed here since 2000, you have to sort of wonder if they're also wondering if they can in fact control it. It's not so much that they've suddenly become enlightened or they recognize down the road that they have resource problems, they have pollution problems, they have an international pressure on greenhouse gas emissions, but they have a systemic question of whether they in fact can ride the tiger, and that's a tough one, you know. So I think they're trying to institute tighter control over it. They're using lots of market-driven and sort of command and control-driven practices. It'll be interesting to see. I would like to say, for me as a reporter, the one thing I've done that's given me maybe the most insight and the most sympathy for China is a trip I did last year, which was for a journalist, sort of like the dream come true, which was I got to spend about 7 or 8 weeks, and I followed the length of the Yellow River through China. And I went up into where my former assistant, Michael Zhao, who is now on his way to being my future boss, did that really nice video about Shanghai. And so I will say to him, I went there first. But I went up and started at pretty close to the mouth of the Yellow River and stayed with ethnic Tibetan nomads and listen to them talk about the grasslands and the climate change. And they had all these amazing traditions of the 2 lakes at the mouth of the river, not below the glaciers, but sort of where the river begins to really take shape. They had these thinking that they believe the dragon lives in the lakes, that the dragon is a god of rain, and the dragon was upset because of mining and fishing. And so the dragon was 20-year drought mad. And I asked this guy, I said, well, maybe it's not the dragon. Have you heard about these scientists? They're talking about this climate change thing. And he kind of looked at me and he said, what's the difference? Yeah. And so one man's dragon is another man's global warming. But the trip was illuminating for me because I went from Qinghai into Ningxia in Inner Mongolia, where you see desertification and you see incredible poverty. And I'll never forget meeting, just by sheer coincidence, two women who were had bound feet, and they had their feet unbound by Mao, because when Mao and the Communist Army took over their section of Shanxi province, they were liberated, and they saw that as a great liberating moment. And they had lived in this isolated village for 50 years. They had lived through the Great Leap Forward. They lived through the Cultural Revolution, and they described taking landlords to the edge of the cliff and tossing them in the Yellow River. They had endured everything that China's history could throw at them, and they only moved because finally drought was so severe, so intense, that they simply could not survive. And so they moved to this village beside the Yellow River. And what was fascinating about this tiny little village that anyone in this room would look at and think, oh, it's just a poor little village on the river, and they just grow corn, is that I think there were 90 people, and they came from 7 provinces. It was a migration target because the demand for water in that region was so great. This was a place on the river. They could go there. And so what was, in following the river, the reason I gained great sympathy is you see the struggle for people to make do with sort of insufficient resources. You also see some really questionable policies. And in China's economic template has always been to build, 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 grow, grow, grow. The coast did it first, and now all these areas inside the middle of the country want to use that as a template. And so I went to Incheon, which is the provincial capital of Ningxia, which is a quasi-province, and they were building an entire new city because they wanted to spark real estate development. And so the government and the major cities are doing this everywhere, built an entire second city beside the old city in hopes that a third residential private development city would grow. And they were doing this despite a really uncertain water future. And their explanation for it was this was an economic model that worked in Wenzhou, or that worked in Shenzhen, or that worked on the coast, but they weren't really kind of picking up on there's some differences between the two areas. I mean, they were, but I just think this is they wanted to catch the wave, They wanted to catch the wave. So, and I finally ended up on this trip in Zhengzhou, which, I went all the way to the river, but to me it sort of symbolically ended in Zhengzhou, and I was in a high-rise apartment in a gigantic Japanese-designed, quite sleek and nice, actually, new city of 24 empty towers, each 20 stories or higher, surrounded by a pumped-in lake where they had colorful fish, 8-lane circular roads where there was not yet a car. It was like, here's the future, hurry up and get here. And I went into one building, and the 3 people had moved in because the building was just opening. It's probably full now. And I sat there with this woman in her flat screen, watching her flat screen TV with her laptop with wireless. And I thought back to starting with the nomads, where I'd slept beside a pile of yak dung. And I thought, that is China's enormous challenge. It is trying to do in 30 years what the rest of the world did in 500. It's trying to evolve. I mean, I wrote this in the story, but it's trying to move from nomads to flat screen TVs, and it's just a stunning challenge. And I've written stories that have been tough at times on the government's approach to dealing with it, but you can't, and no matter what the system, you have to look at it and be just astonished at the undertaking. Almost done. I frantically started writing a speech last night when I saw how good everyone else was. So one of the advantages of jet lag, you're up all night. I guess the final thing is to talk 2 things. One more about being a journalist and a little bit looking ahead. Being a foreign journalist in China is a wonderful thing. I will be in China for another year, and then I'll move somewhere else. I'm not quite sure where, but it'll be fine. But I doubt it will match China as far as its importance. And it is a terrifically important place for the future for all of us. And being a foreign journalist there is sort of complicated because, as I alluded to earlier, I think certain people, I'm sort of squatting here, I think certain people look at us and see us as you're too hard, you're too soft. And I winced a little bit yesterday. There was a nice guy, and he raised this question of our series, and he sort of framed it he framed it as if it were an accusation against China. And my friend Wen Ranjiang turned around immediately at me and started laughing. And because he knew I would be embarrassed by that. And I was, because I would argue it's not. I would argue that that what I try to do as a journalist is to be, I don't know, this is a little silly, but to look at it from the perspective of what's the relationship with the government and the governed. How do these policies impact the people in China? And that's why it's such a complicated thing, because the Communist Party can rightly say, you know, we have lifted X 100 million people out of abject poverty, and then we've got another 600 million to go. I'm not quite sure of the exact numbers. So it is and yet at the same time, it's obviously clear that sometimes their policies leave a lot to be desired. And as a foreign journalist, I focus on that. We look at that because we look at how they're being applied. We look at how urbanization works for the people whose land has been taken away. We're not just on how it grows new cities. So, you know, there's a whole debate. Winran referred to it yesterday, which is, you know, there's, I think, a line of thought with certain political scientists now that have Americans been suckers? Have we been, you know, too engaging of China? And in fact, they're really not going to change, and that we need to rethink our expectations. I'm not going to get involved in any way in that debate, but I do think it's interesting to note that I do think it's unlikely that I think China's going to make its own future, and we should realize that. And that obviously the hope for the individuals is they're going to have a more accountable political system. But you know, it's going to be China's going to do it, and so that will be an interesting path to watch. And it will be one that bears directly on the future. One of the things I've noticed in the discussions here was when we talk about global warming, the temperature literally is just rising outside, it rose inside a little bit. And as a reporter, I was sort of intrigued by that, because my guess is most people in here are fairly like-minded on global warming and its importance as an issue. But the future debate between US and China will be very interesting to watch, because China has an interesting and not illegitimate argument that you had a big party and now you want us to pay for it. And the United States has, and the rest of the world has a big argument that says, you're going to have a tremendously big party and it's going to come at a terrible time. And so figuring out responsibility, figuring out who pays for what is going to be interesting, and it'll be particularly interesting because it's all going to boil down to trust. Jan yesterday made some really interesting comments about that the way to get something done in China is to be patient, to develop relationships, and to build trust. And you know, it'll be, as a journalist, it's going to be interesting to me to watch how the biggest definitive, not the biggest in terms of people, but the world's dominant democracy and dominant world power, and the world's biggest, most populous authoritarian state find trust, and how we do it. And it'll be quite interesting, and what our expectations are. Because I think that as we get back into this political debate about what do we expect from China, well, we now know that we hope and expect that they're going to improve their environmental situation. It'll be interesting to see how far, you know, you all in this room all want to take a role in helping do that, and I think that's really admirable. It'll be very interesting to see when it gets down to the nitty-gritty on things like technology transfer, how big companies are going to treat that, given the intellectual property right problems in China. So I think that we're going to have a really interesting future that apparently the future of the world hangs on. And it will all, in many ways, the relationship between the United States and China will be at the center of it. And the environment, which I think was once a sort of tangential issue, and I'm sure I haven't been here for much of the Bush administration, but I'm sure people here would think it's been tangential in the United States at times as well. But I think that it will be interesting to see how these two come together. There have been a lot of good exchange programs. I know the EPA has been doing a lot of things in China. And so anyway, I'm going to wrap it up with that. But I really appreciate your time. And do you want me to take, if there's, oh, you're going to come up? Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Jim, for a really terrific talk. In spite of your severe jet lag, you did a magnificent job of summing up the conference, even being able to identify people who had made particular remarks.
I'm a reporter.
Wow. The Chinese, I learned that one reason the Chinese officials all smoke is to keep themselves awake. And now, you know, they don't have that luxury anymore. So I don't know how you do it. I guess that's the training. Of course, your ability to cite so many people here is in many ways, it's an interesting return on our investment, because so many of us rely on you for a lot of our knowledge about the Chinese environment. So, hu hui hu li, you know, mutual benefit. Just one, I'm sure there's a ton of questions in the room. I hear the corks going out of the wine bottles. I don't want to hold you up very much, even though I had some brilliant remarks that I wanted to make in terms of summing up, but I want to allow people to have questions as well. But one thing I wanted to ask you to get the ball rolling is how you see yourself being used, if you see yourself being used. But you know, you talk about, some people say you're too hard, some people say you're too soft. In the Bay Area, we have certain politicians who selectively will draw on certain things about China and use that as a way of wagging their fingers about how China must do this and must do that. And then people can rely on, draw things out of your articles to talk about severe environmental problems and authoritarian regime and that sort of thing, where other people can draw a different lesson about, look how they're paying attention to this, look how they're letting me do these kind of stories, and they're really, China can lead the world in trying to find solutions for these things. So do you know the degree to which below the radar, your material is being circulated, translated, and used by the elite in debate? Well, both. Translated into Bushian English, or translated in, lived in Texas, so you know how to speak that, or translated into Chinese.
That's a good question. I think about that a lot, and I've been thinking about it a lot as we've been doing this series. I'm sorry. I've had many people who are very environmentally interested send me notes saying that they were glad we're paying attention to this. And then often in notes they'll say, you know, but it's also true that the United States could use a kick in the pants too. And so I think that, and I've been recently getting notes from different NGOs pointing out, you know, some of the things China has been willing to do that the United States has not been willing to do, particularly on sort of technical energy grid questions. So I think I've touched on some of it. I always try to pose the stories not so much China versus America, but more like China struggling to move forward. However, just because that's the way I frame it doesn't mean that's the way it's framed in the public. I do know the stories are widely circulated, certainly among scholars and scientists in China, particularly the first series on inequality got a lot of attention because it was right on time. I mean, that issue was really coming into the consciousness of the leadership. I'm pretty sure this one gets circulated as well. Occasionally I Google. I'm in China, so I'm really disconnected. But I do Google. I go through my tunnel and I Google my name and wait about 2 weeks after a story, and then I Google that subject just to see how it's being played in the American blogosphere, and if it's someone's taking a very smart criticism that I hadn't thought about, or whether someone's taking a pot shot. I think that journalists are always used, and I'm sure that many people in the public would think we always use. That relationship is certainly complicated, and but my guess is right now the United States and China are actually sort of cooperating somewhat, I think, on not pressuring each other too much on global warming. That's going to change as the stuff in Bali pushes us into an international, broader process. But Mr. Keynote was in Beijing, and when he was there, he was very understanding of China's position on global warming. So, he didn't choose to make hay of it. Someone told me the Democrats are talking a lot about China in the debate. I haven't seen that. It's not surprising. It's a labor issue, usually in the Democratic Party. China is the job stealer. It'll be interesting to see. That's how it's portrayed. It'll be interesting to see how the environmental component plays in the debate, if it does. Usually the Democratic president tacks right back to, be friendly to China or relatively friendly to China once they're in office. Clinton did that, you know, so that's cynical. That's American politics. Yeah.
One of the things that I think is missing in the U.S. coverage of environmental problems in China, which I think reflects U.S. censorship or censorship on the U.S. side, is the responsibility of U.S. corporations and the U.S. government, which has been touched on a little bit in this conference. For example, you have the catastrophe of the Three Gorges Dam, which is social, environmental, but it was the World Bank and the international financial institutions with the U.S. government dominates that were big supporters of this. You have corporations in the United States, many from the Bay Area, that are shipping hazardous production operations to China and then claiming to have social, corporate social responsibility problems so they can wash their hands of what the effects are for workers in China. You have the computer dumping that is taking place in China. 80% of all the electronics in the world are being dumped in China. So, you know, it's sort of one way that's these things occur is because U.S. corporate and U.S. government institutions are offshoring a lot of environmental problems, and that doesn't come out, the responsibility for that doesn't come out in the coverage here. It's like China's always at fault.
I think that's an interesting point, and I would say a couple of things. First, the series is not over, so you never know what might come down the pike. And second, actually the World Bank did not fund the Three Gorges. That was so controversial. They've funded plenty of other dam projects, but the Three Gorges was such a lightning rod that my understanding was they weren't involved, and they just saw it as the politics was so heated. Someone here maybe can correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Yeah, they didn't. The Three Gorges, I mean, one of the interesting things about the Three Gorges, and I actually think that this is a factor in the government's response in changing the media, has been that, you know, the Three Gorges Corporation has a publicly listed subsidiary. And if you look at the day, I should have put this in my story, and I'm just too stupid to remember to do it, but the day the Xinhua report came out talking about catastrophe, the stock in the Shanghai Exchange, I think, was at 13.3, and last time I checked, it was at 9. So there's some motivation beyond just public relations in changing the storyline of the Three Gorges. The Three Gorges Corporation is also going to become one of the big state-owned companies that's going to build dams in Myanmar. They're going to build dams in Burma. I'm not trying to distract away from your central point, which is correct. And Ma Jun, in particular, his group has got information that on the supply chain and the globalized supply chain. In our particular series, I mean, we just haven't quite gotten there yet. But again, it's not over. And my guess is we will get to it. And secondly, in the broad scope of coverage, I feel like the Times hasn't ignored this problem. I feel like we're not, I mean, us personally, we have not hidden from it. The computer, and the computer waste problem has been written about a good bit. It just, you know, it probably just doesn't have the same impact, I mean, as some of the other stuff. But it's unequivocal. Your main point is absolutely right, that we are all integrated into China. Our economy is hip lockstep with theirs. They build our stuff and keep it cheap, and we allow their economy to modernize because of it. And that's the deal. You know, I don't think Americans all realize that, but that's the deal. And so now they've got to clean up. And that's going to be the big question for the global warming debate: is how much is our responsibility?
Any other questions? Everybody's burned out? Was there one here?
Hi, actually following up a similar question. So a lot of the pollution is a result of production of goods that are ultimately exported back to the United States, EU, and Japan. And a lot of the US companies from Japan and the EU are taking advantage of lower labor costs as well as less environmental regulations. And stop manufacturing in their home countries, effectively subcontracting manufacturers to third parties in China, and whether explicitly or implicitly taking advantage of the lax environmental enforcement there. in terms of the U.S., do you see any shift in thinking of trade policy as one way to address this, of requiring more labor as well as environmental standards in terms of trade?
I don't cover U.S. politics anymore.
Right.
I used to. But someone here spoke about some of the possibilities to create financial incentives through taxes on American corporations that do that. I think there was a recent study that traced 25% of China's carbon emissions to foreign exports, 25, which is a huge percentage. Again, I would just encourage you to check your website. I think this subject will be directly addressed as far as the notion of environmental transfer from wealthy countries to China. I think that scientists have referred to the whole notion of pollution havens and the idea that pollution can become concentrated. Majan earlier talked about the idea that we're the production zone and the rest of the world is the suburbs. Latin America, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that too. This is, of course, a bargain that the Chinese government wanted, and they asked for. They wanted this because this is how they built the country. They are complimented as being far more open economically than Japan ever was, or than South Korea was, or that most of the Asian tigers were. And so it's, yes, unequivocally, multinationals have a responsibility. And I mean, I'm not a politician, I'm just saying from the facts. But it's also true that these factories weren't rammed down their throats. So we're just sort of now we're hitting the scale has gotten at such a level that it's raising the questions. And so how it's addressed is going to be the great, for my successor, is going to be one of the great stories of China, and how China applies these new environmental policies.
You've been very generous with your time, and everyone here has been very generous with their time. And so why don't we once again thank Jim for a tremendous closing speech. I will spare you my brilliant closing remarks. All I want to do is thank the participants again, the panelists, the keynote speakers, all of the audience for your really enthusiastic and energetic participation, and also once again to thank Hillary Fincham-Sung, Shannon May, John Groschwitz, Eleanor Levine, and Daniel Kolta, who I didn't realize had his arm in his wrist in a brace even before he started taking notes. This conference has been taped, so there will be a webcast available hopefully on the BCI website. How long does that take? About 3 weeks, and Daniel will have a report sometime, and we're not sure exactly where that will be posted or made posted on the same website. Great. Okay, so we have a reception in the back for everyone. Thank you once again for your attention and for participating.